Hey everyone, welcome to Beaconsfield podcast. It's my great honor today to be speaking with Professor Uday Mehta. He's a brilliantly original thinker who I'm very much excited to be speaking with about Edmund Burke and Mahatma Gandhi. He's Distinguished Professor of Political Theory at the Graduate Center, City University, New York. He's the author of two books, The Anxiety of Freedom, Imagination and Individuality in the Political Thought of John Locke, and Liberalism and Empire, a book that frames Edmund Burke, the alleged founder of modern conservatism, as the 18th century's most formidable and impressive critic of empire. And he's currently working on a book on Gandhi with a forthcoming title, A Different Vision, Gandhi's Critique of Political Rationality. Uday, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jack.
So Uday, one of the things that's always drawn me to your work is that you think about great leaders as thinkers. You are interested in those thinkers who find themselves in the midst of politics on the battlefield, having to think about morality and action in a way that will actually have consequences. So it would be wonderful to speak with you today about the relationship between the thought of Edmund Burke and Mahatma Gandhi as two thinkers caught up like Arjuna on the battlefield, trying to work out how to be and act morally. And so perhaps we can start with something you've been recently thinking about, which is the project of self-knowledge. So my first question is, how did the project of self-knowledge unite Burke and Gandhi as thinkers on the battlefield, thinking in the midst of politics? What was the project of self-knowledge and why did it matter to them as philosophers in action, if you like?
So, you're right. I think Burke and Gandhi share this concern with morality in the midst of action. Even though Burke never read Gandhi, I think Gandhi must have read Burke. And I think what unifies them in this concern with self-knowledge is that they are hesitant to let morality assume an abstract form. So morality for them is something that has to vindicate itself in the midst of action. So I've written somewhere that, that Gandhi is not a principal thinker. And the reason why he's not a principal thinker is because principles have to be abstract. And I don't think Gandhi has abstract principles. Unless one thinks of self-knowledge as an abstract principle, but it's not typically thought of as a moral principle. And I think similarly for Burke thinks that you have to prove yourself in the midst of action. As you must know, there's this famous passage in Reflections where he says, for some people, circumstances don't count for anything. For me, they count for everything. And I think that's a sentiment Gandhi would have agreed with. So he thinks, I think, that personal vigilance or personal discipline is the point of entry into ethics and politics. So,
Do you think that, yeah?
I mean, both strike me, Burke and Gandhi, as having a certain kind of resistance to instrumental forms of thought.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he famously says, I don't know if it's famous, but he says things like, we Indians should not demand of the British anything that, such as independence, because we want to consider them as friends.
Mm.
And the point of friendship, according to Gandhi, is that it must give unconditional support to the person you want to be friends with.
Mm.
So he doesn't think friendship can be, you can't ask for something in return of friendship. So, I mean, one way of putting that is friendship can't be a contractual agreement, because in contracts, you're typically asking for something.
And it's reasonless as well, right? And that's, you talk about that. It's very interesting because what comes to mind immediately when you say the word contract is Burke. You know, Burke's speaking about a social contract across from past to present to future, but it's more of a covenant. It's less rational. And
Yes.
It comes back to this notion that of principles in the work of both thinkers. It's interesting because when people are reading Burke, you know, particularly that phrase, you know, circumstances give distinguishing color, discriminating effect to every action. There are two ways of reading him. Some people read him purely as a circumstantial thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And then some in the United States particularly have read him as purely a principled thinker.
Yes.
And what I find interesting about Edmund is that he's both.
Yes.
And it's the question of how do I work out which actions need be moral, need be intrinsic, when I am caught up in the dense medium of politics, is the question that Burke grapples with his entire life. And it's very interesting that you mention unconditional love or friendship on the part of Gandhi, because it seems to me, Uday, that, and we'll get into this a bit more, but it seems to me that Burke is the more strategic thinker of the two, in the sense that Gandhi is concerned purely with the moral realm and with self-discipline as to what it does for an individual in the project of self-knowledge.
Yes.
Burke is also interested in that work, but there's this extra element where he's more of a politician than Gandhi. And there are times when you can see him playing with rhetoric, playing with ideas, whether it be Guildhall, Conciliation, Fox's East India Bill, in a way that Gandhi doesn't do. Not to say that Gandhi doesn't have the ability to do so. He absolutely does. But what do you think of that, Edmund being slightly more of a politician or a political thinker than Gandhi?
I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, what I take to be the single most important thing that Gandhi ever said is towards the beginning of his autobiography, he says something to the effect, what I have sought to do these past 30 years is to see God face to face, to attain moksha. And all my actions these past 30 years, all my actions in the public sphere have been for this purpose, which later in the paragraph he explicitly calls a spiritual purpose. And so what's significant about that passage is not only does he mention the priority that this spiritual purpose has for him, he makes it clear that that purpose, that all of his public actions are subsidiary to that purpose. So, I mean, I take that as indicating politics is not his priority. Another example I can think of is that in Hind Swaraj, he makes it explicit that independence is not his point, his purpose. Political independence is not his purpose. I mean, nationalists like Savarkar always, I think they read him right. He was not a nationalist. I mean, there are various parts of Hind Swaraj where he says what these other people want most. There's a quote I especially like. It's something to the effect that what these other people want to replace the tiger with is what these other people want is to replace the tiger with another tiger without changing the nature of the tiger.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's how he thinks of nationalists, as they want to just assume the role of the colonizer. And he thinks that's not what he wants. He wants a deeper critique of modern civilization.
It's fascinating because, you know, if I can go back to my last point, now I've changed my mind because that is what Burke is doing too, is it not?
Yes.
Isn't Burke going for a deep critique of imperial civilization as it has expressed itself in that point in time?
Yes.
Perhaps, Uday, then, if they're both concerned with, in the midst of politics, asking ethical questions and trying to penetrate to these deeper questions about who I am and what I will allow myself to do. And we'll talk a bit more about that question on behalf of the nation in a moment. But perhaps the difference between Burke and Gandhi then is one is concerned in an explicitly spiritual form of enlightenment, Moksha, Gandhi, given his tradition and his scripture, that is the vocabulary, if you like, Rorty style, through which he comes to these questions. Whereas Burke, I wouldn't think of Burke as a Christian thinker. I would think of Burke as something more of a, it's not the right word in this context, but of a humanist, you know, with someone with a deep commitment to human nature as a kind of reasonless thing of codified by social grace and manners and etc., but something that has an inherent dignity too. Like, for example, in the Hastings impeachment, the final charge is in the name of human nature itself. That, for me, and I think for David Bromwich too, is the kind of primordial commitment that Burke has. Would you say that that is the difference between the two then, that one is concerned with this conception of self-realization through discipline, and the other is concerned with asking the deeper moral questions of human beings? They're not so different, but one is to see the face of God and the other is to see a human face, if you like.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, the thinker who I think is closest to Burke is Levinas, because he emphasizes the face as the ground of morality. I think let me come back to what I think is central to Burke, which is Burke, like Gandhi, is, I think, a brilliant psychologist.
Mm.
What worries Burke is the distortions that the empire has brought, the distortions that the empire is bringing to the English. It's distorting their society. So he says somewhere, he's speaking in Parliament, and he says to his fellow parliamentarians, what you don't realize is that the phrase he uses, these young boys who are not mature in their capacities. Those are the boys you're sending to the empire.
Mm.
And they're learning something there. And they bring that back to England, and they marry into your families. And hence, they distort the social structure of England.
Mm. Is it the delinquents of India have become the commons of Great Britain? That's the phrase you're referring to. Yeah.
Yes. So, God. Any case, another passage I can think of is, I think this is in the Guildhall speech, where he refers to the vices of the poor have become the poor have assumed the vices of kings.
Yeah.
And he links that with the spirit of domination. So what domination does is it inverts the ordinary moral psychology of people. So the poor are behaving like kings. And he doesn't like that. He doesn't approve of that. So do you understand what I'm trying
Absolutely.
to get at?
So it's the reason he doesn't like it is because it undoes the moral integrity of people. And this is what's so interesting. I mean, you have the phrase in one of your lectures, you write, I quote, "How one behaves towards outsiders cannot but affect how one comes to see and understand oneself," close quote. And this is the very, very interesting maneuver that relates Burke and Gandhi and probably Abraham Lincoln and Dr. King as well. And that is that I myself am molded and modified by what I do to others. What I find fundamental in my own dignity can and will be displaced by my mistreatment of others. It's right. This is the notion of the moral imagination, that there is this kind of language, this kind of set of scriptures that connect you and I. And if I fail to treat you in a way that accords with my own best self, with my own highest principles, I lose myself. And that to me, Uday, is the moral essence at the heart of Edmund Burke's thinking. It's extremely rare because you have this Irishman standing up in the English Parliament trying to make the case that the English are not living up to their own best selves, that they are betraying their nature as a people of rectitude and restraint in raping and pillaging in India. And, that's what the boys, the young boys who govern there without society are. They are the archetype of that English boy who goes over to the empire and then loses his sense of Englishness. And that's what Burke's worried about. It's going to come home and undo everything valuable about his choice of inheritance at home. And you know why that's so interesting? And because as you raised in your lectures, Gandhi does the exact same thing. Like if I can just read out a section from the final pages of Hind Swaraj. So he goes, quote, "You English who have come to India are not a good specimen of the English nation, nor can we, almost half anglicized Indians, be considered a good specimen of the real Indian nation. If the English nation were to know all you have done, it would oppose many of your actions," close quote. And to me, that is a Burkean passage. Burke could have written that himself, and it might indicate that Gandhi had read him there. But that's about moral integrity, right? That's about becoming undone by what one does to others. And this is
I think you're absolutely right. And that passage ends with, for us Indians, and for you, the Brits, to have a healthy relationship in which we treat each other as equals. We have to root that relationship in our scriptures. And the word "our" is crucial. What we have to do is go back to our scriptures. And then alone can we engage each other as human beings. I mean, that's how I read the passage, that what's crucial about that passage is that it talks about self-betrayal, and it talks about how to get rid of self-betrayal, and finally, how to treat the other. It's only through overcoming self-betrayal that you can treat the other as an equal. So, you know, he doesn't talk about power. He doesn't talk about inequality. He doesn't talk about economic power or abuse of power. So, I mean, I think that's striking. You know, so his conception of the empire is that it is not good for the moral hygiene of either the English nor the Indians.
And it's so fascinating because that there's a humility at the heart of that on both of Burke and Gandhi's part. And that says, you know, you mentioned before that you studied with Richard Rorty. I guess the way to say that is that for both of them, these scriptures are but vocabularies. But they're but ways of speaking about, or they're just ways of asking the ethical questions in the midst of politics. They're the language of those questions. And that's whether it's the English tradition of liberal restraint or the Indian tradition of self-realization. And I think what Gandhi's realizing in that notion that one must come to the project of conciliation through overcoming self-betrayal is that both him and Burke, if you like, just have different ways of speaking about human nature. And this is something I wanted to ask you. It was, though both are moral and spiritual thinkers, and Burke is too, they seem always grounded in a project of human integrity. They seem to me, both of these thinkers, to be men made for another time, perhaps for another world, who felt this kind of deep need to hold on to who they were in the dense medium. And at the heart of that is this belief that there is something redeemable about the state that they are in. And if we think about the context in which both of these men lived and worked and led, that is an amazing thing. Do you think, Uday, that both Burke and Gandhi are reformers who believe in the capacity for change by preserving and improving rather than radically upending, because they see something redeemable about the social and political state they are in? Because this is another link between the two of them. They're both conservationist, not conservative, conservationist. What do you think?
So let me give you an example. I agree with you. So there is this interchange between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Ambedkar was the famous untouchable intellectual who was trained as a lawyer. He got 2 PhDs, one at Columbia, one at LSE. He was brilliant. He was
studied with Dewey, didn't he? Or was that with the?
Yes, he studied with Dewey. So he writes this work, Annihilation of Caste. I think it's in 1934, in which he makes the following argument. Untouchability is crucial to Hinduism. And Hinduism relies on the caste system. Or let me restate that. The caste system is crucial to Hinduism. Untouchability is crucial to the caste system. Therefore, untouchability can only be reformed by getting rid of Hinduism. Gandhi disagrees with that. And he disagrees with that, not because he disagrees with the notion of untouchability, but he disagrees with the notion that Hinduism should be abolished. And the reason why he opposes untouchability is because within Hinduism, they're not treated as Hindus, not treated as human beings. But Hinduism can be reformed without abolishing it. So the way this links with your point is that, as you use the very good word, they're both conservationists and they're both anti-revolutionary. And I think the reason for them being anti-revolutionary is because they both think that revolutions destroy the integrity of people. Burke, I think it's in Reflections, though it could be in further reflections, says the real France is not, it's different than the France of today. So there is a contrast between the real France and the France that the Jacobins are asserting is France. So he is pointing to this contrast between the real and the apparent. And he's saying this contrast is the product of revolution. And this contrast makes people lose their integrity. I think Gandhi thinks similarly. And let me come back to one important thing. If you ask the question, why does Gandhi emphasize overcoming the fear of death? Here's what I think. I think modern politics, in the English tradition at least, is anchored in the notion that one must overcome the fear of death. And the only way we can do that is through politics. Gandhi thinks we must invite death. That's why I emphasize courage is the central notion in Gandhi. What makes us courageous? Certain acts of non-instrumental behavior. So things like spinning, things like celibacy, things like silence, these are the things which Gandhi identifies as having no product. And these are the very things he emphasizes. Why? Because these are the things through which you lose your fear of death.
Because he sees courage as the commitment to die for what one believes.
Yes.
And in making that commitment, that very real commitment, as you say in your writings in 1919, when he's asking people to sign the Satyagraha pledge, he's saying, I'd rather have one person who makes this commitment with the full integrity of their moral being than many thousands who could design and run a protest movement. Because he's concerned, as you said, not with the political outcome of independence, but with trying to remind the Indian people of who they are by going back to their scripture. And it's, I want to come back to courage in a moment, but just on this scriptural point, why do both Burke and Gandhi think that scriptures matter? Why is it that old ideas or old conceptions of who one is based upon their history matter to Edmund Burke and Mahatma Gandhi? What's the moral psychological thinking behind that assumption? Because if that assumption is incorrect, then the whole project of self-knowledge, rhetoric, and reform is going to be ineffective. So why is it the right insight? I think it is. I want to understand why they think that.
I think why they think that is that for both, religion is the language of self-exploration. And self-understanding. So if you start from the proposition that what is important to both Burke and to Gandhi is self-realization, and then you go on to ask the question, through what can I achieve self-realization? I think the answer for both of them is through a certain kind of religious language. Why religious language? I think because that's what they think, or that's what they take to be the route to self-realization. Now, they could be wrong about that. No. So, as I've written somewhere, it's the grammar of interiority. Religion is the grammar of interiority. Somewhere Gandhi says, I don't believe in that an atheist can actually exist. And he's not saying that I don't believe that somebody cannot, that you can't believe in the non-existence of God. I think what he's saying is even the atheist functions within what Wittgenstein would have called a language game. So religion is the language game in which we navigate ourselves. And or a different way of putting it, for some people, religion is tied to a belief in God. I don't think it is for Gandhi.
Because he's concerned with the interior space of the inner life.
Yes, and he thinks access to that is through religion. But he doesn't believe that that conception of religion requires believing in God. So in the passage I referred to from the beginning of the autobiography, he says, what I want to achieve is moksha. The most common translation of that is freedom from the body or salvation. But it's not safety. It's not avoiding death. It's a form of freedom.
What does that courage then look like on Burke's side of things? Is Burke, like, if I can read out two passages that I came across in reading the work, I noticed that when you're talking about Gandhi's conception of civil action and his conception of courage, he says, it's much, quote, better that people say openly what they have in their hearts without fear of consequences and enforce the dictates of their own conscience, close quote, than either live this untruth or in this state of untruth. And Burke in the Guildhall speech, and I think Guildhall is, I think it's 1780 around that. I think he's just lost or he's about to lose Bristol or not recontest. And he says to his constituents as their representative, quote, I did not obey your instructions. No, I conformed to the instructions of truth and nature and maintained your interest against your opinions with a constancy that became me.
Yes,
quote.
yes. And that's one of my favorite passages from Burke. And it precisely because of how it ends. Constancy that became me.
Yeah. I will not self-betray. That's about reaffirming and reclaiming moral integrity.
Yes, and that's also why he thinks democracy has to be rescued from the idea of representation. Why? Because representation can allow you to be false to yourself in a way in which in Burke's conception of democracy, what makes democracy valuable is if it makes you care about yourself.
That's the wardrobe of the moral imagination, the language that permits us to do that.
Yes, yes.
It's fascinating, Uday, because I wrote my honours thesis on Burke's approach to institutional reform in India. And I drew a lot on your work and David's to help me do that. And I've probably thought of him then as an institutional thinker. And I don't think he is now that I've come to think about it more. He's far more concerned, like Gandhi, with the interiority of the inner life and with the way that scripture / institutions developed on the basis of that scripture, though customarily and organically, can come to inform the way we reach into ourselves. And that for me is the interesting thing about courage for Burke. If he finds himself standing up for his real inheritance, and we should note that for Burke, it's a choice of inheritance. Unlike Gandhi, Burke comes to another nation and he finds something in their scriptures worth believing in and standing for, to the extent that he does so more than those who are naturally English. But the reason I ask this question is, for Burke, the project of courage seems to be about what leaders do, what a man like Burke does to stand up for the founding ideals of a place and to try and remind a people who they are through rhetoric. Whereas for Gandhi, he seems to be more demanding more of individual ordinary people. It's not enough for Gandhi, like Burke, as it is to be a representative who does this on behalf of people. Gandhi wants everyone to do this.
Yes, yes.
And he wants people to be heroes. Is that correct? Is Tagore's criticism correct?
I'm not sure I would agree with the word heroes. Look, I think of heroes as people who are recognized as heroes. So heroes is, for me, it's a public category. In that sense, I don't think Gandhi is concerned with that. He is concerned, as we've been talking, about a certain kind of interior integrity, being true to oneself. Now, I think what that turns on for Gandhi is a certain kind of ability for self-mortification. So, so in one of the articles I sent you, I talk about why does Gandhi insist on recruiting people in India to go and fight in the First World War. And my understanding of that is that Indians have to prove themselves as not caring, not having self-preservation as their highest value. They have to be prepared to die for what they believe in. And even if that is fighting for the enemy. So, I mean, on this issue, Gandhi lost a lot of friends. I mean, he was criticized by, C.F. Andrews, who said, how can you ask people to fight? How can you ask people to go to war? And I think Gandhi's answer was, that's the only way they can develop this integrity, this selfhood. So what's the relationship between that and heroism? I don't think it's direct.
Fascinating, because it's 1918 or 1919 and 1918. Yeah. Gandhi thinks that one has to have the capacity for destruction and the desire for destruction in order to properly overcome it and affirm one's own moral integrity. It's not enough for the chances of political circumstance to make it out so that non-violence is an option for you. You need to make the conscious decision and commitment to overcome the lower angels of your nature in pursuit of self-realization.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating, Uday, because in some ways, the prospect of moral failure is integral to both Burke and Gandhi's thinking, because they have to believe that human beings can and will fail to live up to their own expectations in order to try and be the bridge between that lower and higher self. And that's where they see their rhetoric, probably Burke more so, hitting the point. Could we bring this into the realm of rhetoric? Because we've been speaking about moral integrity, I think, from the perspective of individual people. I might be incorrect in that, but number one, to what extent does the analogy between self-integrity on the behalf of an individual carry through to the integrity of a people or of a nation? And if that integrity is marred and dismantled and undone on behalf of the collective, what's the role of rhetoric in connecting up that gap between where people are and who they want to be?
So Burke often talks about the British nation has to be true to itself. And I think what he means by that is we, the British, have to be true to our selfhood. And he has a conception of selfhood. And, you know, it's located in the British link with its own past. And in that sense, he's different from Burke, from Gandhi. Gandhi's conception of national selfhood, to the extent that he is a nationalist. And, you know, as I've said, I don't think he is a nationalist, but he cares about this other category, civilization. I don't think this may be one of the differences between the two. I don't find in Gandhi this idea of the nation being true to itself.
Yeah.
Which is a rhetoric that is very much part of Burke's way of thinking. So, you know, a central argument in Burke's Conciliation with America speech is the Americans have developed a sense of themselves as a people. And therefore, we should let them have that sense. I don't think to step back. So part of a central component of Burke's anti-imperialism is that the empire violates people's collective sense of who they are. I don't think you find that kind of argument in Gandhi. Gandhi's anti-imperialism comes from the fact that the empire, to repeat myself, destroys the possibility of the moral hygiene of the people, whether it's the imperialist or the community that faces the imperial power. He doesn't think that that's got an issue. That issue is linked to the domination of two people. While Burke does think that a community must be true to itself, that it should not distort another community that has a sense of itself, and that the only way that distortion can happen is through various kinds of power. Commercial power, political power, you know, so do you see the contrast that
I do, yes. So if I can just try and reconstruct it. So Gandhi thinks about things in purely moral terms that see it as a question of two people and who they are to each other. And there is something atemporal about that relationship because it's a moral relationship. And if I can pull in your references to Kant that you make in your writings, you know, the notion of Kant's attitude to enlightenment, or enlightenment being an attitude, the courage to think for oneself, that's the way that I see Gandhi thinking about imperial relations. They're attitudinal, they're atemporal. They are about who we are to each other in moral terms. Whereas for Burke, it's still that question, though it's couched in this pre-established contexture of history, custom, and identity. And it's a question of who we are in relation to our past, our customs, our values, our ideals, our place, which is something that you emphasize in Liberalism and Empire. And so it seems to me that to ask who are we as a nation, you know, is to think historically and is to think circumstantially in a way that Gandhi would never think as an attitudinal, atemporal, moral thinker. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. You've put it better than I have.
In terms of rhetoric then, because one of the amazing articles that you sent through to me, it's amazing because in that piece you articulate everything I've been trying to think through for the last year. You start off by writing about rhetoric and what rhetoric is. And you say that there was this distinction in the classical world between the kind of Platonic style of thinking that was correspondence-based, that sought to, as Rorty has, you know, built up that critique. Then there was the kind of Aristotelian approach, which sought through rhetoric to draw upon extant circumstances, sentiments, attitudes, views, beliefs, ideals, and to rework them through language towards a new...
Through habit. And through habit,
yeah. And to rework them, to try and bring a people with you on the journey of reminding them of who they are.
Yes.
Why, you know, when I think of Edmund Burke, I don't think of him as a philosopher. I don't think of him as a statesman. I think of him as a political writer of the highest order. Because he's dealing in that rhetorical move. Why is rhetoric useful for the project of self-knowledge? Why is rhetoric the most effective medium, perhaps, for asking those ethical questions in the midst of politics, for trying to affect moral integrity, bind it up?
I'm tempted to say, and I say this, I think I say this in my piece on rhetoric, is that rhetoric is a form of making something internal through habit. So rhetoric has a very close relationship to habit, in my view, and I think in Aristotle's view too. I think that for Gandhi, the corresponding notion is doing something over and over again, such as spinning, such as silence, or such as celibacy. You know, these are products that don't, these are actions that don't have a product, in a way that rhetoric has this product of consolidating the self. So it's like, think of it this way. Every religion I know of asks the believer to repeat prayers.
Mm.
So in Hinduism, the priest tells you, say this prayer 100 times. Or in Christianity, they say, when you go to confession, the priest often says, repeat the Lord's Prayer so many times. Now, if you ask the question, why are they asking you to do the same thing so many times? I think the answer is because they are concerned with changing your internal self.
Mm.
So it's not, so what would the contrast be? The contrast would be, is something like mathematics, where once you know that 2 + 2 = 4, you don't have to do that particular sum again. So, if a math teacher was to say, multiply 2 + 2 18 times, you'd say, why? At least that's what I would say. But if a priest was to say, repeat the Lord's Prayer 36 times, you wouldn't want to ask the cognitive question. I've understood the Lord's Prayer. Why do I have to say it so many times? So the contrast, I think, between certain kinds of knowledge is, if you learn it once, you've got it. The contrast with other kinds of knowledge is that you have to repeat that to create the internal effect that you wanted to create.
Yeah.
And that's where there is an analogy with spinning. I mean, every turn of the charkha is identical to the one preceding it. So why do you have to do it so many times? I think the answer is because Gandhi has a conception of interiority, of it's analogous to the notion of patience. You just cannot. The effect of patience is tied to time. So at various points in Hind Swaraj and other places, Gandhi emphasizes patience. And his interlocutor in Hind Swaraj says, why do I need to have patience? And Gandhi's answer, even though he doesn't say it explicitly, he says, I think he believes that patience is the thing through which you will get to know yourself.
I've always asked my question, Uday. I've always asked myself the question, why does Burke, after he gives the first speech, first opening 4 speeches, the Hastings impeachment, and he knows that the rules of lower courts are going to be applied and the thing's not going to work out. Why does he choose to go on for another 7/8 years? And it's patience, because it brings me back to Gandhi's thinking about the Gita. I went and read Gandhi's commentary this week. And, the central idea in that is one must do things because that is one's duty, right? A Kshatriya to a Kshatriya, to act. And you have to do so without looking to the fruitful consequences of those actions. You do so, as Arjuna comes to realize from the guidance of Lord Krishna, because in acting, in doing your duty, in rising up, you affirm your own integrity. You do unto your habit. And that is what Burke is doing in the Hastings impeachment. It explains a lot of his of his noblest moments, whether it be Guildhall or whether it be his speeches on India, he's doing what Gandhi is doing with the spinning. He's trying to say that morality needs to be a part of the quotidian day-to-day experience of life. And that in every single moment, I choose who I am and what I will allow myself to do and what I will stand for. And I do that regardless of the strategic or political consequences because of what it does to me, of what it says about me. And he doesn't mean that in a colloquial sense. He means that they both mean that in the deepest sense, at the deepest level of reality.
Yes.
And
I mean, the one, I'm repeating myself, I think Burke is more concerned with what a nation has to do for itself than what Gandhi thinks that you cannot think in terms of nations. It's always individualism. And I think this is a significant contrast between them.
yeah.
So I don't think Gandhi finds the question, what is India, very interesting. In fact, he's asked this question several times. And
whereas Nehru would, right? That's a Nehruvian way of thinking. So the discovery of India. Gandhi wouldn't write that book.
Yes, Gandhi would not write that book. So his answer to the question, what is India, is there is India in the Middle East. There is India in South Africa. There is India in East Africa. And that's not the question.
Yeah.
So he's answering the question. He's changing the topic. He's answering the question, what are Indians?
Yes.
And I don't think Burke would change the topic. He has a good answer to the question, what is Britain?
Yeah. At the same time, you know, there's that phrase that you finish your paper on Burke on, and it's from Guildhall, and he says, you know, if I did not act in the way that I am acting, I would not be an Englishman. I would not be a Whig.
Yes.
And then basically he ends with the phrase, something like, I would not be a man. And you know, so he walks you through the concentric circles, the little platoons back to this kind of grander, capacious category of man, him or herself, as you use that phrase. That's your phrase.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that Burke cares about who Britain or what Britain is, these kinds of grand national questions, because he sees them as the purview by which to get to that interiority. And he realizes that if he doesn't speak in this language, quite frankly, people are not going to listen. It's not going to tug on the heartstrings modified by scripture and ingratiated by habit. But, you know, it comes back to that final charge of the Hastings impeachment once again. He moves in that impeachment from what Hastings has done to dismay the parliament, then the nation's laws, then the Indian people, and then human nature itself. It's a gradual walk back to humanity through the experiences that form and shape it. And in that sense,
so if I can interrupt. So what Hastings has done on Burke's account is he has betrayed what it means to be an Englishman, what it means to be a human, and Hastings' defense of this is the phrase geographical morality. And Burke finds that unconvincing. Why? Because he thinks we're all human.
And that's exactly it. There's something important about the ordering of those identities, because they end from the local to the human. And that comes back to Rorty's point again. You know, it's these are but vocabularies through which we are trying to see the face of God.
Yes, yes. I mean,
Rorty wouldn't use that phrase. That's Gandhi's
yes,
phrase. But
yes,
Rorty would say that human face.
Yes.
So I think it's just interesting because to tie it up for this conversation, it's been an incredibly interesting and fascinating conversation. And I'm so honored to have been able to speak with you. But I think what I've personally taken away from your work, Uday, is to ask the ethical question in the midst of politics, in the dense medium, is to always come to political action with a view of one's own moral integrity at the forefront. And that's a very interesting maneuver, because these thinkers, these leaders, refuse to cede the terrain to the political vocabulary alone. They refused to see themselves as anything but moral, as anything but a constant work in the project of self-knowledge. And that is a way of reading Edmund Burke and Mahatma Gandhi, but particularly Edmund Burke, that is extremely rare. And so I'm very grateful for the work you've done on that, because it's very much shaped the way that I see him as a thinker who is far more than the alleged founder of modern conservatism. He's something far more.
Yeah.
As David,
I like your term conservation.
Yeah.
As distinct from conservative. So, yeah. And that's a term that unifies Gandhi and Burke.
Because it's about moral integrity. It's about how do I draw on my own scripture to bind up the nation's wounds or the person's. Yeah. So thank you so much, Uday, for coming on. And it's been an amazing conversation. And I look forward to engaging with more of your work and reading the book on Gandhi when it comes out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so
I've
much.
enjoyed this very much.
Thank you.